Okay.
May I?
Yes, I was about to say. You're still on the program.
Okay. Now, in our public schools, through the Supreme Court, we cannot, Dr. Scott says, well, should it be the Christian, should it be the Hindu, should it be this or that? None of the above. You see, we can't bring the book of Genesis or the Bible into the public schools in discussing origins, or the Hindu or anything. No, bring in none of them. What we can do is compare a theistic, supernatural, special creation, result of an intelligent agent, versus a non-theistic or atheistic, materialistic theory of evolution. We can compare the two, what each would predict. Then we look at the scientific evidence. Now, Dr. Scott says, you can't do that. If you bring in any evidence for creation, oh, that's religion. You've got to exclude that. You can't even bring in a challenge to evolution theory, because that's hidden creation science. You can't do that. Now, that's totally, totally wrong. Someone said, you know, after this great catastrophe there in New York City and in the Pentagon, that all these people prayed and Congress prayed and these people prayed and these people prayed and these people prayed, but the children can't pray in the schools. Everybody else can pray, but not our children in the schools, because that's bringing religion into the schools, you see. Well, what these people want is freedom, not freedom. Our Constitution guarantees freedom of religion and academic freedom, supposedly. But what these people are insisting is freedom from religion. You have no supernatural entity that can be suggested or inferred in any way. What is that? That's atheism. And that is violation of the United States Constitution. It violates separation of church and state.
Okay. Okay. Well, I was hoping some of these questions would smoke out some differences.
I hate to step on an applause line.
Okay.
But I imagine there were a lot of children praying after the disaster of the 11th. But I think it would be very...
Not on school time, they weren't.
I imagine there were a lot of children praying to whatever God they worship, in whatever fashion they worship that God, and whatever different traditions of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any other religion. But these prayers should not be led by a teacher. That's the difference. Nobody's saying kids can't pray in school. What they're saying is that teachers can't lead those prayers, because that is establishing a specific religious view upon a student, and parents have the right to determine their children's religious beliefs in a public school. They don't have a school teacher does not have a right to impose his or her religious belief upon the students, which as an authority figure they would be. Besides, what prayer are you going to use?
Okay, let's move on to the next question. I think that last one definitely smoked out some differences between our panelists.
What? There are differences among us?
Yes. Okay. The next one is kind of aimed at Duane Gish. One of the things that seems to be true over the years is that questions arise that start out as questions that are partly scientific, partly theological, and so forth. And as time goes on, the evidence builds to the point where one side clearly is wrong for whatever reason. One example of that, perhaps, is the quote that was used against Galileo at his trial, which is in the book of Joshua. Joshua said, in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon, in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped. Now that was interpreted at the time as meaning that the sun moved through the sky. Of course, now, in a day of spacecraft trips to the moon and satellite TV, we know that the apparent motion of the sun and moon through the sky is caused by the Earth's rotation. Or at least most people would agree with that. There might be a very small minority that don't. And so in this case, it's a situation where the Bible actually was reinterpreted from a perfectly reasonable interpretation that the sun was a small light moving through the sky, which is what everybody thought, is what it looks like certainly, to another one that was a lot less obvious but turned out to be true. Keeping this in mind, would it not be possible for the scientific evidence to accumulate to the point where you would be forced to accept a reinterpretation of Genesis, say, either in terms of how long it took God to create the earth or what mechanism he used and so on? Would that be something that could be acceptable to you? And if so, what kind of evidence would it require?
Well, you have to remember that we say there's no contradiction between science and the Bible. First of all, you have to interpret the Bible correctly, and secondly, you have to interpret the facts of nature correctly. Now, the greatest problem Galileo had was not with the church. It was with his fellow astronomers. They wouldn't even come and look through his telescope. They said he was dead wrong. And of course, the philosophy of that day, they kind of went along with that idea. The Bible doesn't teach that at all. The Bible doesn't teach a geocentric universe. As a matter of fact, the way I read it, it could be either geocentric or heliocentric. It doesn't teach the geocentric that everything goes around the earth. It doesn't teach that at all. It doesn't teach that the earth is flat. The fact is, the Bible says God looked down on the circle of the earth, and so much more of that kind. Now, certainly, there are times when there are apparent contradictions. I think when people really do their, you can find apparent contradictions in the Bible all the time. I'm an idiot. Any idiot can do that. But to discover to look at that evidence and look at the language, the original language, how it can be interpreted. You see, you've got to look at that, and you've got to look at all these facts. And then you can decide if there's any apparent contradictions or real contradictions. I don't think there are. But there are some apparent contradictions. There have been, but they've been eliminated by very careful study of both theologians and scientists.
What about sun, stand thou still?
Well, now, if you were there, now, here's the Bible. I'm glad you brought that up. I meant to respond to that. Here is the Bible statement those people said. What did they say? They're right there and said, the sun is standing still. If you were there, what would you say? The sun is standing still, wouldn't you? Apparently, that's what you're seeing. Now, they didn't say, well, the motion of the sun around the earth is stopped. They didn't say that, now did they? What the Bible reported accurately what these people were observing, what they said they were observing. The sun is standing still. Now that doesn't mean
Duane, I was actually
wasn't a
asking
scientific explanation at all.
Okay.
And only subsequently have we found that the planets actually go around the sun. And there's no contradiction there.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was really asking about Bob's question, which was the reason why I brought up that particular passage is because there's very, very good historical evidence that at one time Christians interpreted the sun stand thou still, a passage in Joshua, as being evidence for a geocentric Earth.
Oh yes.
And I think it's very clear historically that some passages in the Bible have changed in their interpretation. Surely you wouldn't deny that.
But not all people interpreted that. Certainly, there's still people today who believe in a geocentric. There are people, scientists.
Let's let Hugh talk about it here for a second.
I can speak to this because I did a 2-hour television documentary on Joshua's long day, and historically, there was a lot of dispute about what that passage meant, not just today, but even in the early church fathers. And the consensus that you can pull from the Hebrew of that particular text is it's either referring to an extra period of light or an extra period of darkness. The text is not clear whether it's 24 hours of extra light or 24 hours of extra darkness. And therefore, it all depends, and when you look at the context, did Joshua need his troops to be cool so they wouldn't be exhausted, in which case you go with the darkness interpretation, or did they need to see their enemies, in which case you go with the light interpretation? The other thing you can pull from the text is evidently this miracle was limited to the valley of Ajalon. Now, my wife and I have actually visited that valley. It's a rather small valley ringed by hills, and therefore one can come up with God performing a miracle meteorologically that would produce the extra darkness or the extra light. Now, I would argue in the case of Hezekiah's sundial, you have a more significant miraculous event because the miracle, according to Isaiah, was seen not only in downtown Jerusalem, but in downtown Babylon. And so we're talking about something that covered a much broader geographical area, but in this case it lasts only 40 minutes. And so what we do in our television special is look at the different possible miracles that God could have performed to fulfill that event, but none of those miracles would violate astrophysics in terms of the motion of the sun, moon, and stars, or violate the Hebrew text.
Were you asking about miracles, or were you asking about changes in Christian interpretation of the Bible?
A little of both. I wanted to find out how people would respond to this in the sense that there has been what is apparent change in interpretation, but of course certainly one possible way to respond to it is to say, well, there really wasn't. It was only an apparent change in interpretation. There was even a disagreement back then as to what it meant, and so on. So I think it's a fair answer that Hugh gave. Let me go on to the next one here, which is aimed a bit at Hugh. One of the most changeable and hardest to verify experimentally sciences is cosmology. The Big Bang theory is quite recent, and there have been many others proposed over the years. When I was a graduate student, I briefly thought about going into cosmology, and the cosmologists that I knew used to joke that the neat thing about being a cosmologist is that nobody could ever prove you wrong because nobody could do an experiment in cosmology. So the question that I've got is how reliable is it using cosmological arguments to infer things about science or God when probably the Big Bang is only going to be good for another couple of decades and they'll come up with something else like colliding brains they're talking about these days?
Well, I went into radio astronomy because I saw the potential there for developing the kinds of experiments to actually put cosmological ideas to the test. You know, in terms of the Big Bang theory, you need to realize that there are dozens of competing Big Bang models. In fact, I give that as one of the evidences that the Big Bang theory is correct, the fact that we have such diversity of models. Now, the model that's been overthrown, of course, is a standard Big Bang model. So sometimes you read in the newspaper that the Big Bang's been overthrown. It's simply a reference to the simplest of these Big Bang models called the standard Big Bang. And really no astronomer believes in the standard Big Bang model anymore. But they still believe in some kind of Big Bang. And what's, I think, is healthy about the discipline is the details on this Big Bang have been getting greater and greater as every year goes by. Now, to put this in theological context, we need to recognize that the earliest record of the Big Bang was not Albert Einstein or George Gamow or Penzias and Wilson. It was Job and Moses. Job and Moses were the ones that first stated that the universe can be traced back to a transcendent creation event, where time itself is created when space, matter, and energy are created. The most frequent description we see in the Bible about the universe is that it's continuously expanding. 11 times, 5 different Bible authors make that comment. The other thing you can discern is that the Bible declares that the universe was much hotter in the past than it is today. The Bible tells us the universe is governed by entropy, the law of decay, and that the laws of physics are constant, which means that the universe must have been much hotter in the past than it is today. Those are the 3 most frequently described characteristics of the universe in the Bible. They're also the 3 fundamental descriptives of the Big Bang. All Big Bang theories have those 3 points in common. They differ in the details, but they agree in those 3. Is science going to advance to a point where the Big Bang will be overthrown? I don't think so. It'll advance to a point where we can begin to come up with a more detailed Big Bang model than we have today, and I've been writing about that in our magazine, our books. To give you, the lay people that are out there, some feel for the strength of the evidence in favor of the Big Bang, recognize this. We can directly observe that the universe was hotter in the past than it is today, and the amount that it's hotter is exactly what the Big Bang predicts. We can measure the temperature of the universe when it was 1/6 of its current age, 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, its present age. All those temperature measurements are perfectly consistent with the predictions of the hot Big Bang model. We can see that the galaxies in the past were much more crowded together than they are today. I could show you a photograph where it shows galaxies so jammed tight together that they're stripping spiral arms off one another. And today the galaxies are farther apart, so clearly we can directly witness this expansion of the universe from the creation event. And we can actually do a photo album history of the universe. As you look at the universe when it's very young, we see that the galaxies are newborn. Then they become kind of an infant stage, then kind of like teenagers. And now as we look at the universe, all the galaxies are middle age. The fact that all the galaxies have the same age, once corrected for the look-back time, is another piece of evidence of the Big Bang. Now these aren't the strongest evidences for the Big Bang, but they're probably the easiest evidences for the layman to appreciate.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got a comment on that?
Yes, I have a comment. This is one area in which I disagree with Dr. Ross. I think this Big Bang theory is one of the most terrible theories that anybody ever thought about. I've read hundreds of articles on this stuff. And just like Dr. Ross says, there's all kinds of Big Bang theories or variations on it. Why? Because they keep running into difficulties, so they invent something new. You know, to make their theory work, they've got to invent imaginary energy and imaginary matter. They say, now, for example, why do galaxies still exist? The way galaxies are spinning, the stars should have been thrown out into space. There shouldn't be any galaxies. And they took all the total mass in these galaxies and calculated how much gravity was there. Would it hold those stars together? No, it wouldn't do it. So they said, well, there must be something there that we can't see. So it's dark. It's not giving off any radiation. We can't detect any radiation, so it must be cold. So they call it cold dark matter. Strictly an imaginary entity to make their theory work.
Duane,
now,
that's not
just
true.
a minute, let me finish. Now, in this Big Bang theory, they have to have more matter in the universe than they can see. So again, they invent cold dark matter out there. And they said that the rate of expansion of the universe was slowing down. That's what they believed. Then on the basis of some of these supernovas, type 1A supernovas, they said, now we've discovered that the rate of expansion of the universe is increasing. Must be something there then to make it increase.
Okay, can I break in here for a moment, please?
They invented imaginary matter, imaginary energy that had a strange ability. The gravity was contradictory to gravity. It doesn't attract, it causes things to expand. Yeah. So they have imaginary matter and imaginary energy, and boom, the theory works. Yeah.
Okay, can I break in for a moment?
What kind of science is that?
The point is well taken. I want to keep things moving along here a little bit so that we aren't here all night. And so what I'm going to do at this point is to move on to the last question, and then the final part. We'll just see if the panelists have anything else they want to discuss. We'll give you a few minutes to do that to wrap up. The last question is this. Is there anything at all that would convince any of you to adopt one of the other two points of view you've heard here tonight? And if so, what would it be? And if not, why are you so sure you're right? Who wants to go first?
Well, if you ask me, first of all, I'd have to say, I'd have to find agreement in the Bible and agreement in science. It's certainly not in the Bible. You can't make Genesis fit evolution. God commanded each kind to reproduce after its own kind. He didn't command onions to change into roses, to apes to change into people. And he described a very, very spatial creation. A very, very spatial creation of man and woman. And you find that in the New Testament as well. So you'd have to agree. Now, furthermore, you'd have to agree with the facts of science. I would say something would make you puzzle. If you could find a whole series of transition forms showing one basic kind, an invertebrate, a clam or a snail or a worm, something like that, over millions of years, you could find this series of transition forms showing that it seemed, apparently at least, to change into a fish. That would be tough evidence to deny. You see, we are scientists, and we have to go by scientific evidence, but we don't find that. That's what we don't find. And what I'm saying, you know, in Romans 1:20, we read that from the things that God has made, we can very clearly and easily discern certain unseen attributes of God, his divinity, his power, and so forth, so that no one has any excuse. And that's what we are saying, that we know from the things that God has made, we can discern these various, the unseen attributes of God. Therefore, God, the Creator, does exist. And if God created us, he's the Lord and Master of what he has created. There must be some relationship between the created and the Creator. You see, that's what we say. We can know that from the facts of science, and it does coordinate or go with the Bible.
Okay. Eugenie?
The question that Bob asked us was, is there something that could get us to change our position? I don't know what my position is here. I guess my position is that I think science should be restricted to explaining the natural world using natural cause, this methodological materialism that I described earlier. I don't think that you should use science to either prove there is a God or to try to prove there is no God, in which case I would differ with my two colleagues here. I recognize that there are many interpretations within Christianity held just as strongly as the positions, Christian positions described by my two fellows here. But I don't think any of them are scientific. And I guess since my position really has to do with separating religion from science and making science truly religiously neutral, as opposed to what you heard described to me earlier by my friend Duane, I guess it would be hard for me to figure what would change my position, because my position is a very basic one.
You?
Yeah. What it would take to prove to me that my position is wrong and I need to change would to see my predictions not coming true and their predictions coming true. For example, if I'm wrong about the universe and the non-theists are right, the more we learn about the universe, the more understanding we're going to have for the physics of the universe from a naturalistic perspective. We're going to see all these design evidences gradually disappear. But if I'm right and my non-theistic peers are wrong, the more we learn about the universe, the stronger will become the design inference, the more design characteristics we'll discover. I'm somewhat encouraged that every 3 weeks we discover a new design characteristic in the solar system, and the probability against a non-theistic explanation gets more remote. But if I were to see that reverse in a very significant way, I would change my position. Likewise with, say, Duane Gish's position. If I were to see that I was wrong about the neutrino mass and therefore there is no cold dark matter in the universe, then I would be encouraged to adopt Duane's position. But if I see the evidence for the age of the universe and for the distribution of matter and energy in the universe becomes stronger and stronger with respect to time, then I'm more likely to stick to my position and reject Duane's. And I think we only have to wait 3 months. 90 days is enough time. There'll be enough new discoveries take place. In fact, our team at Reasons to Believe counts 5 scientific discoveries per day that have theological significance. So with 5 per day, you only have to wait a couple of weeks to see where the trend line goes. I think there's about, good enough.
Okay. The final thing we're going to do here, I said I would give each of the 3 of you a chance to spend a couple minutes summing up or to tell people about your books in the back or anything else you'd like to do. So we'll start with Duane over there.
Thank you. With the Institute for Creation Research, we have 10 scientists on our staff who, all but 2 of whom have a doctorate in science from major universities. So we're a scientific organization. We publish many, many books. On the book table, you find 5 of my books. We couldn't bring all the others, but you find 5 of my books. One book especially, Teaching Creation Science in Public Schools. I document the fact that you can teach creation science in public schools. The fact is, I quote Dr. Scott. After the Louisiana decision, she published a letter to the editor in Nature and said the Supreme Court did not say you couldn't teach creation in public schools. You can do that. And so that book provides that documentation. I have a book on the fossil record, a book on creation scientists answer their critics, and my book on dinosaurs, and another family book, The Amazing Story of Creation from Science in the Bible. We have literature that's free. If you want to be on our mailing list, find the sign-up sheet, get your name on it, and we'll be very happy to send you that free literature.
Okay, Dr. Scott.
I'm delighted you keep quoting me, but I wish you would notice that I have mentioned to you, we were actually in the same panel in the summer of 2000, that in fact I was wrong when I wrote that letter to Science. And I said, speaking as a legal expert, after all, one always goes to a physical anthropologist when you want legal advice, right? That my interpretation of the Supreme Court decision was that, exactly as Duane described, that it made it, it didn't really disallow the teaching of creation science with evolution. Well, I was wrong, because subsequent courts certainly have interpreted the Supreme Court decision to indicate that since creation science is religious advocacy, advocating it in the public schools violates the First Amendment. But as to my point of view, I think that science is an absolutely wonderful way of knowing for discovering what happened. I don't think it tells us who done it. And I think that people of faith, or people who are not religious, non-theists as well as theists, can be inspired by science, can have their religious views or their non-religious views reinforced by what they learn from nature. And I think this has gone on for a long time and will continue to go on, but it should not be confused with science itself. I really feel very strongly about keeping science as a philosophically neutral way of knowing. I think that is where it gives us its greatest strength. And there's no question that the topic that I'm most interested in, which is the topic of evolution, both cosmological, geological, and biological evolution, is one that does create difficulties for Christianity and many other religions. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. I was also struck this evening by how much Hugh and I agree as scientists about what happened. We disagree because our own personal philosophies disagree or are not the same. We disagree with what are the implications of those scientific discoveries. We agree about what happened, we don't agree about the whodunit, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But what should be taught in public schools is what happened, and leaving the whodunit to parents.
Dr. Ross.
Well, I think we need to recognize what an exciting time we live in, the beginning of the 21st century, when we're seeing a truly scientific revolution. To quote from China's famous cosmologist, and philosophically he's an atheist, Feng Li, he has said that science has now advanced to the point where it can directly investigate creation. And I think we need to allow science that freedom to explore creation to the greatest depth possible, in spite of the fact that it might disturb people's philosophies and theologies. This is an exciting time to be alive. Let's provide the freedom to encourage that kind of endeavor. And incidentally, you just heard a little bit tonight about disagreements on this issue. Rather than promote my books per se, which you'll find at the back table, and our magazine, I would like to recommend this book called The Genesis Debate. Rather different views. Duane's views is also the framework hypothesis, but it's a scholarly debate amongst Christians, differences on creation, evolution, Genesis, and other philosophies. So that's available. And also, if you want to see something where you don't have to read, there is this television debate on the John Ankerberg show, where I debated Kent Hovind on the age of the Earth, two creationists who differed on that viewpoint. So those are a couple of opportunities for you to get into these kinds of disagreements in greater depth.
Thank you. Okay, we are now going to open this to questions from the audience. As I mentioned before, we have a microphone right up here. And if people have questions, I invite you to come up and get in line, and I don't know how many of you we'll get to. If there's too many people, we won't get to too many questions.
And we'll try to keep our answers short.
Yeah, and please keep your answers down to a minute or so, if possible.
Hard to do.
Okay, while people are lining up there, let's go ahead and take the first question. Go ahead, just speak in the microphone there.
Dr. Scott, I listened to your description of science, which I thought was very good, well organized.
Can you move up a little closer to the microphone, please?
I also like your concept of keeping the schoolroom neutral. I don't have a problem with separation of church and state. However, what they're teaching in the schools nowadays is an evolutionary model. That evolutionary model has very deep ethical, philosophical, and religious implications. They are not teaching only that which can be tested, and they are ignoring the portions of that model that fails the evidence that can be dug out from the fossil record, from the second law of thermodynamics, and in other areas. I say that it is hypocritical what we're seeing in the schools to call the teaching of evolution science as it is being taught.
I spend a lot of time talking to teachers around the country, K-12 teachers, and if I could possibly assuage some of your concerns, I find the number of teachers who teach K-12 students, well, here's all the evidence for evolution. Scientists are unified in the idea that the universe has had a history, it's very old, and living things shared common ancestors, so take your religion and shove it. I don't find that happening. I don't find atheism being taught along with evolution. Teachers tend to be pretty much a cross-section of the American public, so about 90% of them are religious. So the probability that a lot of atheism is being handed out with evolution is very tiny. I did say, and we agree, that evolution has consequences for religion, but there are so many different varieties of Christianity, plus there's many other religions among school children in the United States. The implications of evolution for religion varies depending on what the student brings into the classroom. I think it's very difficult for a teacher to deal with all of these implications, and frankly, teachers don't want to because they're not trained in theology. Let me just give you a really quick for instance. My two companions here have both argued for a very interventionist kind of theology. Duane more so than Hugh, but both of them have God intervening at regular intervals. Hugh described creating different whales and horses and primates and things like that. This would be a point of view that many Christians would find extremely offensive for theological reasons. Because if God intervenes a whole lot in the universe, that means this is not a predictable universe. If this is not a predictable universe, then we cannot hold mankind responsible for his actions. So what do you do with sin? I mean, there are lots of theological implications of a lot of different views coming out of science. We can't deal with all of them. My feeling is we should deal with none of them. Now, if we, in the science class anyway, these are topics that could be appropriate for comparative religion, and I'm all for that. If we don't teach about religion, that does not mean we are teaching atheism. To say nothing of religion is not to say religion is nothing.
Let me respond. I think we need to respond to that, what she has said. The theory of evolution is being taught, just as Dr. Michael Roos stated, is an atheistic theory. God is excluded. God is not involved in any way in this. It's absolutely excluded. That is not philosophical neutralism that Dr. Scott has talked about and recommended. It's not neutral. It is telling these kids In fact, we started from hydrogen gas, and here we are today from a long evolutionary process by natural being. And that is not theological neutral. It's not neutral in any way. And therefore, and Dr. Scott, I know, opposes to have our kids taught the facts that contradicts evolution, that are contrary to evolution. See, that's just hiding creation. You're sneaking in creation. You can't do that. So evolution then is protected from challenge. When any theory freezes into dogma and is protected from challenge, that is terrible science. It's very, very
I think you get very few teachers and no scientists agreeing that the high school classroom is the place where you slug out different scientific theories. If you want young earth creationism to be taught in high school, you first have to convince the scientific community. You have not. Young earth creationism, I'm sorry, has been around since the early 60s. Scientists have looked at its explanations and have rejected them. It is not considered a valid scientific theory, so that's why it's not taught in the colleges and universities, and why it hasn't trickled down to the high school level.
Sure, the evolutionists control our educational system, they control our scientific journals, they control our media, and they, of course, exclude that. Yes, the evidence is there, it's certainly there, as you heard some of it tonight, but our students are not permitted to hear it.
Okay, I'm going to cut this off at this point and move to the next question, please.
Hi, my name is Andy Snyder. I have another question for Dr. Scott, and I would like to hear a rebuttal from the other panel members as well. This one regards the comment that you made, Dr. Scott, on the origin of life and how there are differences and disagreements among scientists on what that might be. I'd like to know what briefly those are, and then what position you hold and why, and what are the strengths of the evidence for the position that you hold on the origin of life. And then I would like to hear from the other panel members, please.
Okay, because science is just trying to explain natural phenomena using natural processes, wearing one scientist hat, one is looking for natural processes that would produce that first replicating molecule, okay? This does not mean God had nothing to do with it. This does not mean God did not create, if you pardon the double negative there. But what are the natural explanations that are being bandied about? Well, first of all, you got a problem defining life. Because life is not, we can recognize life in the form of a bacterium, but a bacterium is already a very highly evolved form. What if you've got, so basically the definition of life is something that can reproduce and that can change through time. Basically it can reproduce and it can evolve is really what the definition is. So what if you had something that was not enclosed within a membrane like a bacterium is, but which could reproduce? Is that life? Well, it's kind of there, but it's not quite. What about the origin of proteins? What about the origin of reproducing material, the actual genetic material, the DNA? There are hypotheses around about pre-cellular life involving the DNA world, the RNA world, the PNA world, the peptide RNA world. There are many working theories out there, just as there are many working theories about the Big Bang. Now, we may decide within the next, I love Hugh's notion of 3 months, we get all kinds of discoveries, that's true. We may discover a set of observations that really do unify the various researchers working on this problem. They say, yeah, that really works, let's look at it that way. We may not find it for 10 years, we may never find it. That doesn't matter. The important thing is that you look and you try to understand the relationships. It's a very complex problem. I think we've made great strides in it, but we don't yet have a consensus.